The sun shone over the broad parade ground as a hush fell across the assembled crowd. Rows of scarlet-coated guards stood at attention, their black bearskin hats gleaming in the light. Tourists snapped pictures, while diplomats and military officers mingled near the ornate gates. Among them walked Daniel Hayes, a man whose calm smile hid the tension in his shoulders. He moved with purpose, scanning each face in uniform with a practiced eye. To most, he looked like any other guest invited. To this ceremony, to him, every detail was a clue. Daniel had arrived in London only days before. His orders were simple: observe, report, and blend in. The CIA had sent him on a liaison mission to learn about new security measures and to share intelligence with British counterparts. He was not there to make waves. He was there to listen. Still, he could not resist scanning the scene for anything unusual. As an American officer, he valued discretion above all. Yet in the stiff formality of Horse Guards parade, he felt a thrill of excitement. This was the heart of Britain's royal ceremony, and he was an outsider invited in. Not far away, Sergeant Marcus Blake stood like a silent statue. His red tunic fit him perfectly, and the golden buttons caught the sun's reflection. He stood straight as a rifle, his eyes fixed on the distant gate where the royal carriage would soon appear. Marcus had served as a royal guard for nearly 10 years. Every morning he practiced drills until his muscles ached. Every evening he polished his boots until they shone like mirrors. To him, duty was a sacred thing. He believed in order, in honor, in the quiet power of tradition. Daniel watched Marcus from a short distance. He noted the way Marcus shifted weight. From one foot to the other, the slight tension in his jaw as he held his gaze forward. Most guards stared at some fixed point, but Marcus's focus seemed different. It was almost personal, as if he studied each person walking by. Daniel felt a flicker of curiosity. Was this man simply careful? Or was he hiding something that might matter to American intelligence? Taking a breath, Daniel stepped forward across the cobblestones. He moved with the slow confidence of a diplomat, hands folded behind his back. He passed under the arch of the old stone wall and approached Marcus from the side. The bright red of the guard's uniform contrasted sharply with Daniel's dark suit and tie. Marcus's posture did not change when Daniel came close, but he flicked a quick glance sideways. Daniel stopped within arm's length, close enough to feel the gentle breeze blowing through the courtyard. It carried a faint scent of lavender from nearby gardens. "Good afternoon," Daniel said, his voice low but friendly. He kept his tone calm and relaxed, introduced himself as a liaison from the American embassy. Marcus nodded once, stiffly. His eyes flicked downward to Daniel's lapel, pin a small flag of the United States. Daniel followed his gaze and offered a slight nod of pride. "I'm here to learn more about your ceremony," Daniel said. "It's an honor to witness it." Marcus's reply was a single word: welcome. His voice was quiet and measured, like the toll of a distant bell. Then he turned his gaze back toward the open square. Daniel sensed formality, respect, and something else, an element of uncertainty. More than once, the guard's eyes returned to that pin at Daniel's waist. Each time, Daniel felt that same spark of curiosity. He wondered what was behind those eyes, so alert and unreadable. They stood side by side for a moment, watching other guests arrive. Diplomats in crisp uniforms, foreign dignitaries in exotic robes, and the occasional curious tourist who peered over the low wall. Daniel made small talk about the weather, the history of the guards, and the best places in the city to see old architecture. He spoke slowly and clearly, with the kind of polite interest that put people at ease. Marcus answered when spoken to, but offered no more than necessary. His words were polite but measured, like each step in a march. A soft murmur rose among the crowd as a team of musicians began to play a slow, stately march. The guards shifted, heels clicking on the pavement. Daniel's eyes moved back to Marcus. The guard's grip on his rifle was firm. He barely whispered, "They practice every day." Daniel nodded and smiled. He leaned in slightly. "I saw that," he said quietly. "I also saw you watching me." Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. He did not deny it. Daniel paused, trying to read the young guard's expression, At that moment, the distant rumble of a carriage drew a hush over the guests. Everyone turned to face the grand gates at the far end. A golden coach rolled slowly out, drawn by 4 sleek horses. The silver harnesses glinted and bells chimed softly. Inside sat a figure in regal robes, waving gently to the crowd. Applause broke out like rolling thunder. Daniel and Marcus both watched in respectful silence. Even the birds seemed to quiet their song as the carriage passed. When the applause faded, Daniel made his move. He adjusted his jacket and stepped closer to Marcus, lowering his voice. "Tell me," he said, in a tone meant only for the guard's ears, "why were you looking at me earlier?" Marcus's eyes widened for an instant. He took in Daniel's pin again, then glanced toward the officers standing watch. No one else seemed to notice their private moment. The guard's face remained calm as he answered, "I'm here to do my job," he said quietly. "I watch everything." Daniel studied Marcus's face, searching for any sign of deceit. He thought about the sensitive information he carried, notes on troop movements, new equipment details, security updates. If someone here had eyes on American secrets, it would matter.
Oh.
He decided to probe further. "Even me?" he asked softly. "I carry a lot of important papers." Marcus shifted slightly, but kept his voice steady. "Every visitor is important," he said. "Every detail matters." A breeze stirred, lifting the edge of Daniel's suit jacket. The moment felt charged. Like the calm before a storm, Daniel gave a small nod as if accepting that answer, though his mind raced. He thought of his training: always verify, always question. He straightened and offered one last polite smile. "Thank you, Sergeant. Enjoy the ceremony." He turned and walked back toward the crowd, leaving Marcus to resume his vigil. As Daniel slipped into the flow of guests, he glanced once more at Marcus. The guard had resumed his fixed stare ahead, expression unreadable. Daniel paused at a fountain nearby, watching ripples spread across the water. He opened his briefcase under the glare of a nearby lantern. Inside lay his dossier notes, maps, and his credentials. He closed it with a soft click, satisfied that he had the tools to prove any claim he might need to make. Across the courtyard, Marcus held his position as if nothing had happened. He stood tall, a silent emblem of duty and honor. Tourists moved past without a thought, snapping photos of his bright uniform. Marcus did not flinch. He was a guardian of tradition, and he would not break his stance for any distraction. Heart, he believed every visitor was friend until proven the opposite. Yet a small spark of caution glowed in his chest. He sensed that this American officer was more than a polite guest, and he was right to be watchful. The music swelled again as the band struck up a livelier tune. The ceremony continued as it had. For centuries, a dance of color and pageantry. Daniel blended into the background, observing. Marcus remained at his post, alert. Two strangers stood on opposite sides of a centuries-old tradition, watching the other, each guarding what mattered most. The sun dipped a little lower, casting long shadows across the stones. In that golden light, the stage was set for everything that would follow. The afternoon sun dipped lower as the ceremony moved toward its quiet moments. Daniel Hayes stepped away from the crowd, finding a place near a row of trimmed hedges. He opened his notebook and scanned his own notes. He had written down everything. He saw the guard's careful gaze, the way Marcus Blake's eyes narrowed when Daniel spoke of sensitive details, and how Marcus tracked each visitor. Daniel reread his words, drawing a small circle around the note. Watchful guard might be more than formality. He paused and looked over the courtyard. The red-coated guards stood in perfect lines, their rifles resting lightly against their shoulders. Tourists moved in clusters, photographing horses, guards, and distant palace towers. Daniel closed his notebook and slipped it back into his briefcase. He hated making any scene. He believed in subtlety and evidence. Yet something about Sergeant Blake reminded him of a puzzle piece that did not fit. Daniel walked slowly through the ranks of spectators, keeping Marcus in view. He noticed how the guard shifted ever so slightly when he thought no one was looking. Marcus's left boot tapped a steady beat against the ground, as if he were composing his own silent march. A small bead of sweat formed at the guard's temple, even though the day was cool. Daniel thought, maybe nerves, or maybe something else. He moved behind a group of visitors and pretended to admire the ancient stone walls. From this angle, he could see Marcus's face more clearly. The guard's jaw was firm, almost rigid. The ridge of his cheekbones caught the sun. Daniel studied the pins on the uniform's sleeve service medals, years of duty. He noted each one and compared it to a list in his mind of ceremonial guards. Marcus's medals matched perfectly. No obvious clues there. Daniel's heart beat a little faster as he considered his next step. He decided to test the guard. He pulled a small pad from his coat and pretended to jot down observations. Then he turned, facing Marcus squarely. The guard's posture remained unchanged, but his eyes held a question. Daniel tapped the pad as if writing, then closed it decisively. He squared his shoulders and walked toward Marcus again, this time choosing a spot where the guard could not easily look away. "Sergeant Blake," Daniel called softly. Guard tilted his head ever so slightly. He recognized the voice. Daniel lifted his chin, showing the lapel pin of the U.S. flag again. "May I have a moment?" he asked quietly. Marcus's stiff form relaxed in the smallest measure. He nodded once. Daniel moved beside him, remembering the lessons of interrogation. Keep the tone calm, don't intimidate, but be direct. He spoke in a low voice that only Marcus could hear. "I need to confirm some details," he said. "I have information suggesting that someone in this ceremony is gathering intelligence on classified troop movements. I would like to know if you have seen anything suspicious?" Marcus's eyes widened for just an instant. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, choosing his words carefully. Daniel continued, "I trust you have a duty to the crown and to your post. I need to know if you have ever observed anything out of the ordinary, people taking notes, photographs outside permitted areas, or secret exchanges." Marcus's face remained calm. He glanced toward the other guards, then back at Daniel. Around them, tourists and officials passed without noticing. "Ah," Marcus whispered. "Sir, my duty is to guard. I watch everyone equally. I have not seen any weapons drawn or secret messages passed." Daniel studied Marcus's expression. The guard's voice was steady, but his eyes hinted at tension. Daniel pressed on. "I need specifics. What about the man in the dark suit who entered 30 minutes ago?" Marcus's eyes flicked to Daniel's briefcase, as if recalling something. He said, "I noticed him speaking too closely to a sergeant here, but that happens. We all talk sometimes." It did not seem secret. Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out a small photograph. He held it so only Marcus could see, an image of a guard Marcus passing a folded note to a man in a plain suit behind the bandstand. The guard had not noticed the concealed lens that took the shot. Marcus's face paled ever so slightly. He did not speak for a moment, staring at the photo. Daniel waited, calm but firm. "Your badge number is Blake 23, correct?" he asked. Marcus swallowed. He did not deny the badge number. His gaze dropped to the photo again. "I don't know where that came from," he said, voice low. Daniel nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer. He replaced the photo in his briefcase. In truth, the image was unverified. Daniel had asked a local contact to discreetly check suitcases at the perimeter, but he needed confirmation. He leaned closer and asked in a quiet tone, "Is there any reason you might help a foreign agent today? Any personal pressure?" Marcus's chest tightened. He lifted his eyes to Daniel's, and for one frightening second, they held a plea. Then he straightened. "No," he said firmly. "I serve my post and my duty. That is all." Daniel felt a twinge of doubt himself. The guard's answer seemed genuine, yet the photo remained troubling. He closed his briefcase. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said softly. "I will verify this further." Marcus inclined his head and turned back too. His stance, his face regained its usual calm.
Ow.
Daniel walked away slowly, mind racing. He wanted proof he could trust. If this guard really was innocent, Daniel needed to explain the mix-up. If he was guilty, Daniel had to act swiftly. Daniel found a quiet corner by the old stone fountain where water tinkled against carved stone lions. He set his briefcase on. the edge and opened it again. Inside lay his credentials, maps, and his dossier of intelligence. He pulled out a small packet labeled Field Analysis. Inside were intercepts, witness reports, and his own notes. He spread them carefully on his lap. He read the top report. Possible espionage at ceremonial guards, horse guards parade, London source, confidential. Beneath it were lines of code names, times, and locations. Daniel tapped his finger on the time. 3:10 p.m. now was almost 3:15. He knew he had only minutes to decide whether to make his move. He thought of his duty to his agency, to his country. Yet he also thought of the man Sergeant Blake, who had protected every visitor with quiet dignity. Daniel closed the packet and slipped it back into the briefcase. He took a breath. Must confront before leaving the parade ground. He stood and brushed dust from his trousers. He cast one more glance toward the guards. Marcus Blake stood perfect as ever, his gaze fixed on the distant gate. Daniel walked back, choosing his path. Carefully to avoid drawing attention, he passed under the triumphal arch and re-entered the open courtyard. The band began another tune. Tourists clapped. The guards shifted their rifles in unison. Daniel approached Marcus from the front, halting within a few feet. He kept his tone calm and professional. "Sergeant Blake," he said, "I must ask you one more question. Please answer honestly." Marcus waited. Daniel continued. "Have you ever passed information documents, photographs, verbal messages, to anyone not cleared by the Ministry of Defense?" Marcus's face remained still. He paused, then said quietly, "No, never." Daniel's heart raced. He reached inside his coat and withdrew the photo again. He held it for Marcus to see. "Then how do you explain this?" he asked. Marcus blinked, and for the first time, a shadow of panic flitted across his face. He looked at Daniel, then at the other guards standing like statues behind him. No one moved. Marcus's voice trembled slightly as he said, "I don't know." "How that got there?" Daniel looked around. He lowered his voice to a whisper few could hear. "Sergeant, with all respect, I believe you do know. I believe you have been in contact with foreign agents today. You are under suspicion of espionage." At that, Marcus's face went ashen. The crowd around them quieted. A few guests noticed and pointed. Marcus stood frozen. Daniel took out his credentials, showed a small silver badge of the CIA. He spoke with authority. "I request you to come with me for questioning. Please show no resistance." Marcus's eyes darted around. Then he slowly raised his hands, as if in surrender. The moment was tense. Two officers, one ancient ceremony, the quiet hum of the fountain, the distant chime of bells. Marcus's voice was almost inaudible. "I'm innocent," Daniel said. "We will find out." He signaled toward the palace gates, where two uniformed security officers stood. Within seconds, one of them noticed the scene and began moving toward Daniel. But before they could step in, the Mod Police emerged from a side arch. Their crisp, gray uniforms bore the ministry crest. At their head was Captain Eleanor Shaw, her expression unreadable. She strode forward, eyes on Daniel. In a clear voice she said, "What is the meaning of this?" Daniel held up his credentials.
"Captain?"
"I have reason to believe this guard, Sergeant Blake, has engaged in espionage against British and American interests. I request immediate assistance in detaining him." Captain Shaw's eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to Daniel. The courtyard fell silent. Tourists ceased their photos. The band's music faded. Everything waited on her answer. In that pause, Marcus Blake stood rigid, hands at his sides. Daniel Hayes waited to see if his evidence would hold. The courtyard fell silent as Captain Shaw stepped forward, her polished boots clicking on the stone. She wore a crisp gray uniform and carried an air of calm authority. Daniel Hayes raised his CIA badge again, hoping it would settle the matter. He spoke clearly, his voice steady, but urgent. "Captain, this man Sergeant Blake was caught passing secret notes. I have photographic evidence," he gestured toward the photograph tucked inside his briefcase. Captain Shaw lifted an eyebrow. and motioned for her officers to hold their positions. She turned her gaze to Marcus Blake, who stood as still as a statue. His face was pale, but composed. Tourists backed away, sensing the tension. The band's music had stopped, and only the faint sound of the fountain broke the quiet. Shaw spoke to Daniel. "May I see your evidence and credentials, please?" Daniel nodded and opened his briefcase. He removed the small file containing the photo. He also handed over the official CIA credential card, which bore his name, rank, and holographic seal. Captain Shaw examined both carefully. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the credentials hologram and the photo's edge. Meanwhile, Marcus Blake kept his eyes forward. He did not flinch. He held his rifle at a respectful angle, but maintained a loose grip. In his mind, he prayed that the truth would come out. He knew he had done nothing wrong. He trusted the British Ministry of Defense. He trusted that Captain Shaw would know better than to believe a foreign agent's claim without proof. Captain Shaw turned back to Daniel. "These credentials appear genuine at first glance," she said, "but the hologram pattern does not match our records. In this photograph, there is no record of this moment in any official report or security log." She paused, then looked at the photograph more closely, tilting it under the sunlight. Daniel swallowed. He tried to mask his surprise. The photograph had come from an outside source. He had not expected British security to know every ceremony movement by heart. He said, "I understand, Captain. I will cooperate fully. But I assure you I would not bring a false claim before you." Shaw nodded slowly. "I appreciate your cooperation. But until we verify this, I cannot allow either of you to leave unsupervised. Sergeant Blake, please step aside with me, and my officers, you will undergo further questioning." Blake felt his heart pound. He looked at Daniel, confusion and gratitude in his eyes.
"Oh."
Daniel gave him a small, rare nod. Then Blake followed Shaw and two gray-uniformed officers through the archway leading to a side corridor. The crowd parted respectfully, giving the guard space to pass. Daniel watched until Blake disappeared behind the stone pillar. Then he turned back to Captain Shaw. "Captain, may I remain here while you conduct your investigation?" he asked. Shaw considered him, then said, "No, Agent Hayes, you must also come with us. We will take you to the mod security office for a full review of your credentials and your claim." Daniel felt a surge of frustration. He'd come to gather intelligence and confidence, but now he faced the very security he intended to support. He squared his shoulders and followed Shaw's officers. The bandstand lay ahead, the instruments silent. Tourists whispered as they passed. They led Daniel in shortly after, Blake through a narrow door carved with the ministry crest. Inside was a quiet office lit by soft lamps. A long wooden table sat in the center, and at the far end, two desks faced each other. On one desk lay official files, ledgers, and a computer. The other desk held Daniel's briefcase and the photograph. Captain Shaw motioned them to sit on opposite sides of the table. Blake took the seat closest to the desk, with British security files. Daniel sat on the other side, near his own papers. Shaw signaled for two officers to stand behind Blake, and two more to stand behind Daniel. Shaw addressed them both in a firm but fair voice. "I will conduct this questioning. We'll both answer truthfully, one at a time. Let's begin with you, Agent Hayes. Please explain how you obtained this photograph and why you believe Sergeant Blake is guilty of espionage." Daniel took a deep breath. He laid out the photograph on the table and pointed to the folded note captured in the guard's hand. He described how his local contact at the perimeter had noticed a guard slipping a paper to a man in plain clothes. Near the bandstand, he admitted that the source was not official, but he trusted its accuracy. He explained his concern that a member of the ceremonial guard might be compromised, and that he acted quickly to prevent any breach. Shaw listened without interruption. When Daniel finished, she clicked a pen and asked, "And where's your local contact now? Can we verify this source independently?" Daniel hesitated. His local contact was cautious and unlikely to appear in person. He had handed the photograph anonymously. Daniel replied, "I am afraid the contact wishes to remain unnamed due to personal risk. But I stand by the photograph's authenticity." Shaw's expression remained cool. She turned to Blake. Sergeant Blake, please explain what happened. At the parade ground today, did you hand any notes or secret messages to anyone? Blake met her eyes. His voice was calm and measured. Captain, I performed my duty all day as a guard. I greeted visitors, watched the ceremony, and held my position. I did not give any notes or messages to anyone. Shaw looked at the officers behind Blake. One of them stepped forward with a small folder. He placed it on the desk before her. Inside were guard logs, radio transcripts, and video stills from the parade ground cameras. Shaw opened the folder and spread the documents in front of Blake and Daniel. She pointed to the video stills. These images are from our cameras at 3:12 p.m. They show Sergeant Blake in his position. There is no one handing him a note or any unusual movement. She tapped the paper. These radio logs show your communication with headquarters. Every status check was routine. And your guard log shows no entries of any message exchange. Daniel leaned forward. He glanced at the documents, then back at the photograph. He realized with a sinking feeling that the photo showed Blake in a slightly different posture, but the timing and setting did not match any official record. Perhaps the source had picked a split second and called it 3:10, but the official time code was 3:12. That discrepancy could explain everything. Captain Shaw continued. Sergeant, your record is clean, and the evidence does not support the claim. Agent Hayes, I am sorry, but your source appears unreliable. Until we can verify further, I must ask you to leave the premises. You may return to the American Embassy under escort. Blake felt relief wash over him. He nodded once to Captain Shaw, then turned to glance at Daniel. Daniel's face showed regret. He rose and nodded to Shaw, agreeing. Two officers moved. To escort Daniel out, he paused, looking at Blake. He whispered, I'm sorry. Blake offered a small smile of forgiveness. Stay safe, he said softly. Daniel followed the officers through a side door. Blake remained with Shaw as she updated the ministry logs. The office door closed behind Daniel with a soft click. Outside, Daniel walked down a short hallway illuminated by iron sconces. He passed portraits of past ministry leaders and banners of regiments long disbanded. At the end of the hall, an officer opened a door into a small waiting room. A uniformed driver stood by a black sedan. Daniel was told to sit on a simple bench. He placed his briefcase on the floor and stared down at his shoelaces. His mind raced. He had been mistaken, deceived by an unverified source. He felt the weight of his error. He knew he had acted quickly to protect his country, but without full proof. The driver closed the sedan door and beckoned him to enter. Daniel rose, nodded, and climbed into the back seat. The door shut, and the car pulled away from the ministry building. He watched the stone walls recede through the tinted window. Back inside the mod security office, Captain Shaw returned to Sergeant Blake. She shook her head slightly. For the inconvenience, Sergeant, we will file a report and correct our records. You are free to return to your duties. Blake stood and saluted her. Shaw returned the salute. Blake turned and stepped into the corridor. He paused at the threshold, took a deep breath, and straightened his tunic. He walked back to the parade ground, where his fellow guards still stood in perfect formation. As Blake approached, the officers on duty stepped aside. He stood tall. Once more, the sun glinting on his buttons. He took his place in the line, rifle in hand, and faced the open square. The ceremony was almost over. A few tourists clapped politely. The band began a soft closing march. Blake held his stance. Inside, he felt both pride and weariness. He had stood firm under false accusation. He defended his honor without a word of protest. He knew that his duty was not only to guard the crown, but also to guard the truth within himself. Far away, Daniel Hayes sat in the back seat of the sedan, reflecting on his mistake. He touched the edge of his briefcase. He vowed to verify every piece of evidence before acting again. He thought of Marcus Blake, standing alone among the red-coated guards, calm and unbroken. The sedan drove through London streets, the ministry building disappearing behind high hedges. Daniel watched the city's familiar skyline, the Tower Bridge spires, the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, distant twinkling lights. He wondered how many other secrets lay hidden behind the city's grand facades, in the quiet between the ministry and the embassy. Daniel decided to write a new report, one that would reflect his error and the guard's steadfast courage. H. The sun had dipped below the rooftops of London, casting long shadows across the ancient stones of the Horse Guards parade. The day's ceremony was over. Tourists had left, the music had faded, and the parade ground had returned to its quiet, watchful state. The only sound was the soft echo of footsteps as Sergeant Marcus Blake walked back toward the barracks. His uniform still sharp, his boots still polished, but inside him was a tired storm of thoughts. He had been accused in front of dozens of people. A man and agent from another country had claimed he was a traitor, even with his name cleared. The sting of the accusation hadn't left. The words still rang in his ears. Espionage, secret messages, foreign agents. For someone like Marcus, whose life had always been about discipline and honor, those were not just words. They were attacks on everything he stood for. He walked past the small side entrance of the Ministry of Defense and gave a respectful nod to the officer at the gate. The guard nodded back silently. Marcus's new word must have spread by now. Didn't take long in such a tightly watched environment. But nobody asked questions. No one made jokes. The British military had its own unspoken code. When someone stands tall under pressure, you don't mock them, you respect them. Inside the locker room, Marcus sat down slowly on a wooden bench, removed his black bearskin hat and placed it gently on the shelf above him. For a moment, he sat still, staring at the polished floor. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even confused. He just kept thinking, why had the CIA agent picked him? What had led that man to believe Marcus of all people could be guilty? As he undid the buttons on his tunic, another guard walked in. Corporal James Holloway, one of his closest colleagues. James paused when he saw Marcus sitting alone. He walked over quietly and sat beside him. "You all right?" James asked softly. Marcus nodded. "Yes, just thinking." James gave a small grunt. "We heard what happened. Everyone did. Also heard how you stood your ground, and how Captain Shaw handled it." Marcus looked at him. "Do they believe me?" James gave a slight smile. "They believe the facts. Cameras don't lie. Logs don't lie. And you've never given anyone a reason to doubt you. It counts for something." Marcus nodded again, grateful for the words, even if his mind still circled the same question. What made him a target? Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel Hayes sat at a long desk in a quiet room at the American Embassy. His tie was loosened, and his jacket lay folded neatly on the back of his chair. He had been typing for over an hour, carefully putting together a full report of the day's incident. The screen glowed in the dim room as he typed each word slowly, honestly. Without excuse, he began with a summary of his mission, gathering intel on potential leaks and foreign monitoring. Then he described the anonymous source, the photo, and his decision to confront the guard. Admitted the photo's timestamp did not match mod records, and that the footage from British security proved the guard's innocence. He described how Sergeant Blake remained calm and cooperative, never once resisting or causing a scene in the last paragraph. Daniel paused for a long moment before typing. "I made a judgment based on unverified intelligence. I acted to prevent a potential breach, but I acted too quickly. Sergeant Marcus Blake demonstrated the behavior expected of someone in a high-trust ceremonial role. He deserves not only to be cleared, but to be commended. This incident shows the importance of cross-agency communication, accurate information, and respect between allies." He hit save and leaned back. For a moment, he let the silence fill the room. Then he picked up a pen and wrote Blake's name on a piece of paper. Below it, he added a single word: honorable. Daniel stood up, stretched his back, and walked toward the window. London's skyline twinkled in the night. He could see the top of the palace and the streetlights outlining the bridges across the Thames. It was a peaceful view, far removed from the tension earlier that day. Back at the barracks, Marcus finished changing and headed to the small cafeteria where a few guards gathered for dinner. The atmosphere was quiet, but supportive. People gave him respectful nods. Some offered a handshake or a brief good job. No one brought up the accusation. It didn't need to be said. Marcus had passed a quiet test not of skill, but of character. After dinner, he stepped outside and took a slow walk near the parade ground. The lamps along the walkway gave off a golden glow. As he looked out at the quiet stones where tourists had stood only hours ago, he tried to let go of the moment when his world had almost turned upside down, and then something unexpected happened. A small van with embassy plates pulled up near the edge of the courtyard. The door opened, and Daniel Hayes stepped out. He wasn't wearing his badge or formal suit. He looked like any other visitor, just a man with tired eyes and a serious purpose. Marcus saw him and walked over slowly. Daniel waited, hands behind, his back calm but respectful. "I didn't expect to see you again," Marcus said, voice even. Daniel nodded. "I didn't expect to come back, but I wanted to speak to you in person." Marcus said nothing, waiting. Daniel looked him in the I came to say thank you. Not just for your patience today, but for the way you carried yourself. I made a mistake, and I've written that clearly in my report. You didn't deserve that accusation. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Why me?" he asked. Daniel sighed. "Because the information I had pointed in your direction. Someone wanted to cast suspicion, and I followed it without checking deeply enough. But the truth stood by you." Marcus nodded. "That's my job. To stand?" Daniel gave a small smile. "I can see that now." There was a pause between them. Then Daniel extended his hand. Marcus looked at it for a second, then reached out and shook it firmly. "No hard feelings," Marcus said. "I appreciate that." Daniel replied, "And if there's anything I can do to fix what happened, let me know." Marcus gave a small shrug. "I think the best fix is that the truth came out." They stood for a moment in silence, two men from different worlds, bound by a strange event that had tested them both. Then Daniel turned to go. Before he stepped back into the van, he looked at Marcus and said, "You're the kind of man I hope to meet more often in this world." And with that, he climbed into the vehicle, and it drove off into the night. Marcus watched until the lights disappeared. Then he turned back to the courtyard and resumed his walk, a little more at peace. Sometimes, he thought, strength isn't just about standing still. It's about standing still when someone tries to knock you down, and doing it without anger, without hate, just with quiet truth. That night, as the palace bells chimed the hour, Sergeant Marcus Blake went to bed not with pride, but with clarity. He had done his job, and in doing so reminded everyone around him sometimes, the calmest man in the room is the strongest. The next morning, the city of London moved as usual. Buses rolled down busy streets, shopkeepers raised their shutters, and tourists gathered outside Buckingham Palace for another day of photos and guided tours. But inside the Ministry of Defense, something important was happening quietly, without flashing lights or headlines. Captain Eleanor Shaw stood in her office, flipping through a fresh report placed on her desk. It had come from the American Embassy. The file was clean, formal, and full of truth. Inside were details of the accusation that had taken place the day before, along with a full correction written by CIA agent Daniel Hayes himself. In it, he admitted his mistake, explained how an anonymous photo passed in secret had led him to suspect Sergeant Marcus Blake. He detailed the lack of evidence and praised Marcus for his calm behavior throughout the incident. Captain Shaw read every line carefully. Then she closed the file and placed it in the Mod archives under a special heading. Resolved Misunderstandings, International Cooperation. She knew the story would not go public.
Right.
It wasn't the kind of story newspapers wrote about. But in her eyes, it mattered a lot. Outside, Marcus stood once again at his post, the golden buttons on his red tunic shining under the clear morning sky. The courtyard was alive with movement. Another parade was starting, another day of service was unfolding. And yet today felt different. Not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had seen what happened. People were talking. Not with gossip, but with admiration. One of the junior guards leaned toward another and whispered, "He didn't even blink." They accused him of being a spy and he didn't break. "Just stood tall," another responded. "I would have panicked. But him. He just waited for the truth." Marcus didn't react to the words, but he heard them. His ears were trained to pick up even the smallest sounds, and today those whispers felt like small rays of light. He knew respect was something earned quietly, not demanded loudly. That's what had happened. During the lunch break, Captain Shaw came out to the courtyard. It was unusual for her to appear during duty hours, and when she did, every guard noticed she walked straight toward Marcus. He saluted sharply. She returned the salute and spoke in a low voice, just for him. "Sergeant Blake," she said, "I read the final report. I want you to know how proud I am of the way you handled everything." "Thank you, ma'am," he replied respectfully. Shaw continued, "Not many would have stood that still under such pressure. Not many would have shown that kind of self-control. But you did, and your name will be cleared permanently in all records." Marcus nodded. "Damned. I appreciate that, ma'am." She paused, then added, "And that Agent Hezzy's requested to submit a personal commendation to your file. He's also offering to assist with training modules on international communication." Marcus was surprised. He wants to help. Trained Shaw smiled slightly, as he wants to make sure no other misunderstanding like this happens again. Marcus didn't say much, but inside he felt a strange sense of peace. Not because someone had apologized, but because the mistake had led to something good: learning, understanding, and better systems for the future. After Shaw walked away, a young cadet approached Marcus shyly. "Sergeant Blake, may I ask something?" Marcus turned toward him. "Go ahead." The cadet took a breath. "How did you stay so calm? Weren't you afraid when they said you were working with spies?" Marcus thought for a second. Then he answered slowly, "Fear comes naturally, but panic is a choice. I knew I had done nothing wrong, and if you know that, you don't need to shout or run. You just wait and let the truth speak for you." The cadet nodded, clearly learning something important from that single sentence. That evening, back at the embassy, Daniel Hayes stood beside a long table covered in documents, training notes, and small security items. He was preparing for a workshop that the mod had invited him to host. It was unusual, an American intelligence officer sharing lessons with British military cadets, but he felt it was the right thing to do. As he set out the materials, he paused at one folder. On its cover was a photo of Sergeant Marcus Blake. Taken during a peaceful moment of guard duty, the man stood tall, rifle at his side, eyes focused on the horizon. Daniel remembered the moment he had wrongly accused that man. The shame of it had stayed with him, but so had the lesson. He picked up the folder and gently placed it at the front of the table, labeling it casestudy.com under fire. The Marcus Blake example. When the young officers arrived for training, Daniel told them the full story, not just about the mistake, but about how Marcus responded with strength, not anger. He explained how real intelligence work isn't just about collecting secrets, but understanding people. He said what makes someone trustworthy isn't always what they say, but how they behave when tested. The young officers took notes. They asked questions. And most of all, they remembered the name, Sergeant Marcus Blake. A week later, an official letter arrived at Marcus's home address. It was from the American Embassy. Inside was a certificate of recognition signed by a U.S. intelligence director, acknowledging his exceptional discipline, clarity of mind, and honorable conduct under pressure. Marcus read the words slowly, then placed the certificate in a drawer. He didn't frame it or display it. For him, the real reward had already come: respect from his fellow guards, peace in his heart, and the knowledge that he stood for something real. As time passed, the event became a quiet legend in the training halls of the MOD. Instructors would mention it during lectures. Trainees would nod in respect when walking past Marcus on duty. And tourists continued to take pictures, never knowing that the quiet, focused guard in the photo once stood at the center of a storm and never flinched. One crisp morning, as a new group of guards took their positions, one of them whispered to another, "See him? That's Sergeant Blake, the one who stood still, even when the CIA tried to take him down." The other replied, I hope I can be like that someday. And so, Marcus Blake's name lived on not through medals or loud headlines, but through quiet respect, quiet strength, and the example he left for others. Because sometimes, true power doesn't come from shouting or pointing fingers. Sometimes, it comes from standing your ground when the world is watching, and waiting for the truth to arrive. And that was exactly what Marcus Blake had done.